At 47, Kurt Vonnegut published Slaughterhouse-Five. He had been a struggling writer, a car salesman, a PR man, and a failed playwright. He had seen war firsthand, lived through firebombs, and raised 6 children, 4 of whom were adopted after his sister's death. He had produced a shelf of novels that garnered little attention. And then suddenly, almost accidentally, he became one of the most important American voices of the 20th century. When people recall Vonnegut now, they picture the wry, cigarette-smoking humanist, the man who wrote about time travel in Dresden. But in 1969, when Slaughterhouse-Five came out, he wasn't young, he wasn't new, and he was certainly not destined to succeed. He was 47 years old. Why does this matter? Because we live in a culture obsessed with precocity. We valorize the 22-year-old founder, the 30-year-old Nobel laureate, and the poet who dies before publishing her second book. To be 47 in America often feels like you are past your prime, coasting toward irrelevance. And yet Vonnegut's story punctures this narrative. It raises the uncomfortable, thrilling question. How much can be done late, when everyone thinks the window is closed? Our culture has always been suspicious of age. Fitzgerald made it clear in This Side of Paradise. The whole point was to capture the fleeting brilliance of youth before it calcified into routine. The Beats chased a similar myth, reckless vitality that had to burn out quickly. Silicon Valley today has its own catechism, Zuckerberg's infamous line, "Young people are just smarter." It's the same fetish rebranded. But history doesn't quite bear this out. Galileo was in his 40s when he published his most radical works. Thomas Paine was 40 when Common Sense reshaped political thought. Susan B. Anthony was 52 when she cast her first illegal vote. The assumption that genius peaks young has always been a convenient myth. It flatters the ambitious and terrifies the hesitant, and it also blinds us to the fact that many of history's breakthroughs came from people who had been around long enough to see the patterns that others missed. Vonnegut is a particularly vivid example because he had already failed. He had written science fiction for pulp magazines, novels like Player Piano and The Sirens of Titan that earned him modest attention but little money. He was not a wunderkind. He was a mid-list author, typing away between family obligations and day jobs. By the logic of our culture, he should have given up. Instead, he wrote the book that only someone with his scars, his age, and his accumulated oddities could have produced. There is dignity in failure, especially prolonged failure. Consider Melville, forgotten after Moby Dick, reduced to writing insurance reports, rediscovered decades later. Or Emily Dickinson, who failed in the most invisible way, unread in her lifetime, her poems quietly fermenting in a drawer. Vonnegut's failures were of a different sort. His books did get published, but with disappointing results. He was a writer who could fill a shelf in a used bookstore, gathering dust beside more fashionable authors. But that experience mattered. Slaughterhouse-Five is not a young man's book. Its humor is laced with bitterness, its form is fractured by time, and its philosophy is resigned rather than triumphant. Only someone who had seen things fall apart repeatedly could have written it. And maybe this is why age can produce greatness. Youth thrives on conviction. Age is forced into complexity. Vonnegut could not tell a clean story about Dresden. He knew memory was fractured, and that trauma distorted time, that irony was the only language left. His narrative jumps back and forth between decades, between planets and battlefields, because that was the only way to be honest. Middle age is rarely glamorous. Dante placed himself midway in our life's journey in the dark wood, lost and confused. The Greeks had their crises too. Solon supposedly argued that you could not call a man happy until he died, because only the full arc could reveal whether fortune had spared him. At 47, Vonnegut was in that territory. He had no assurance his career would matter. His books were not chart toppers. He was supporting a sprawling family on uneven income. He had lived enough to know the absurdities of both war and corporate America. And out of that stew came Slaughterhouse-Five. This matters, because middle age is often treated as decline, the moment when one's creativity has been used up. Neuroscience papers are circulated to show how fluid intelligence peaks in your 20s, how mathematicians do their best work before 35. But there is another kind of intelligence, crystallized, layered, associative, the ability to see connections across disciplines, to synthesize long experience into something new. Vonnegut's novel is precisely that kind of synthesis: war memoir, science fiction, satire, elegy. Vonnegut's war had always haunted him. As a young soldier, he was captured in the Battle of the Bulge, held in Dresden, and survived the firebombing by hiding in a slaughterhouse basement. It took him decades to turn this into art. Some traumas resist immediate rendering. Primo Levi needed years before If This Is a Man could be written. Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy required the hindsight of the 1990s to reimagine the First World War. Vonnegut's 47-year-old self could finally write what his 25-year-old self could only, and barely, endure. Slaughterhouse-Five is not cathartic. It doesn't end with redemption. The famous refrain, "so it goes," is less about acceptance or closure than about repetition, about the endless cycle of death. The book offers no comfort, but it does offer recognition. And that recognition is the work of age. Life, all this living, all this striving, is a long apprenticeship that can't be compressed. Some writers learn style and voice quickly, others take decades. Henry James distinguished between the young genius and the late bloomer, but suggested both paths were legitimate. Vonnegut's early books were uneven, witty, but scattered. He had not yet found the tone that made him distinctive. By the time he reached Slaughterhouse-Five, he had rehearsed irony and satire and science fiction tropes and autobiographical fragments enough times to finally bring them together. 47 wasn't late, it was right on time. The Parthenon was rebuilt multiple times. Sometimes greatness takes patience, not precocity. Why does our culture cling to the idea that if you haven't made it by 30, you won't? Part of it is economic. Industries want to exploit youthful energy at low wages. And part of it is romantic. The myth of the prodigy is more cinematic than the tale of the slow grinder. But part of it may also be anxiety about mortality. To celebrate the late bloomer is to admit that our lives can change radically past middle age, which is destabilizing. If anything can happen at 47, then perhaps we can't measure ourselves against arbitrary deadlines. Vonnegut mocked all deadlines. He wrote about time as nonlinear, about events existing simultaneously. In Slaughterhouse-Five, Billy Pilgrim becomes unstuck in time. And that phrase could apply to Vonnegut himself. His career looked like a sequence of failures until suddenly, it wasn't. We are all unstuck in time. Our successes and our failures do not unfold in neat order. Sometimes they arrive decades late. Remember this. Kurt Vonnegut was 47 when he wrote his masterpiece, and this fact should unsettle us. It should challenge the myth that our best years are always early. It should remind us that the middle of life can be fertile, that failure can ripen into art, and that age can distill experience into something no youth could mimic. To be 47 is not to be finished. It may, for some, be the very beginning.